Students for Another Politics, for helping to make a space available, and to the NRA's project and the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion for video support and promotional support and morale support, and everyone for coming at such a short notice. Today is definitely a cause for celebration. We have recently the cancellation of very large pipeline projects. We have an evil company pulling out of drilling in the Arctic, and as well the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, where I'm sort of from. And just last night, the city of Portland, in a legislative move, but that was definitely backed by hard blockades and strategic direct action, the city council of Portland voted to forbid any new fossil fuel infrastructure projects within the city limits. So not just transporting coal and transporting oil trains, and there's sort of like NIMBY projects which are still valuable to get support from, but like no new fossil fuel transport in Portland or the surrounding waterways. So, woo! And so thank you so much to Jonathan, who has come from Colombia, and before that, Florida, to speak about this. And I'll let you maybe introduce yourself in the project. Thanks.
Michelle and everybody else who collaborated to make this possible. It was kind of last minute, but I'm really happy that we were able to make it, and happy to be here with you all. And thank you all for being here. As mentioned, my name is Jonathan. I'll talk a little bit about the Beehive Collective, where we started, our origins, my relation to the collective, a little bit about the Ríos Vivos movement, the anti-dam movement in Colombia, and yeah, we'll tie a little bit everything in together. We'll start with the Beehive information. So I joined the collective in the year 2002. The collective exists since 2000, and it comes out of this common reflection that many people had about what was going on, and at that time it was called the anti-globalization movement. People were participating in these large mobilizations when the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank would come together for their meetings, folks would go protest. And there was a common reflection by a group of people that were the founders of the Beehive Design Collective, that we all understand why these policies don't work and why we don't like them, but we're lacking communication tools. And we're lacking really good tools to communicate to folks about why we're not agreeing with this. And the common conclusion that we came out of as a collective was that graphics, illustrations, served as a communication model, as a language, that it doesn't matter what language you speak or what level of education you have, what cultural background you are, but you can read the images. You can understand that. Even folks who don't know how to read or write can read the images. So we were trying to use the idea of illustrations as a way of making these issues that impact all of us, but the language used around them is very exclusive and not very friendly, and try to make learning about these issues a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic. So we've done graphics about issues like the war on drugs, the Plan Colombia graphic that was launched in 2002. We have one on the free trade area of the Americas that was done in 2000. It was actually our first big graphic. The two we see here today that we're going to go over, called Mesoamerica Resiste as a pair, took 9.5 years to make, was started in late 2003, the research, and was finished in mid-2013. Within those 9.5 years, another working group formed within the collective, and they took 3 years to make a graphic about mountaintop removal and coal mining in Appalachia. Thanks. Where was I? So yeah, it took 9.5 years to create. 22 people participated, 13 of those were researchers. And to be noted, since the Plan Colombia graphic, so with the mountaintop removal, with the Plan Colombia, with this one, we prioritize first-hand research. We feel that in today's day and age, with internet, it would be really easy to go online and learn about these issues and make a pretty good piece or final product that tells these stories. But by not going to the people who have lived these realities, we eliminate the human experience. And we don't have the sensitivity with people's stories of what has really gone down. So our priority is to go to communities and listen to the people directly, what they have lived and how they're living it. And going back to them on a regular basis in the creation of the final product so that they can guide how, metaphorically speaking, we're going to represent their communities and their struggles. This is done in such a way that, because our priority is that we're creating educational tools. And a second priority, a second instance, it would be art. But really we're prioritizing creating these accessible educational tools that tackle these really large issues and are available to all sorts of people. They're all graphics based, so this allows it to be used in all sorts of different contexts. They're done in black and white for a lot of different issues, but one main one is that rural teachers many times lack educational tools, curriculum materials, and to photocopy something in black and white is just a lot easier than color. So that they can make their own educational materials using these posters as a form of social justice clip art, have you. We don't see them as our own stories. We're translators from words to images, so everything is anti-copyright and Creative Commons. Because again, we want people to have access to this. Everything can be downloaded from the website, high resolution, and most of the narratives are available in at least 3 to 5 different languages, depending on who's helped us translate those narratives. Anything, what else? The collective does have a hive. There's a base. It's in a little community called Machias in Maine, down east Maine. About 15 to 20 members are within the collective. About half of them live in Machias most of the year. A lot of them retreat in the winter, but not necessarily. And the rest of us are scattered everywhere else. There's someone in Seattle, there's someone in California, in Wisconsin, in Tucson, 3 people in Toronto, in Washington, D.C., somebody in Mexico City. I used to be in South Florida, and since 2007, I live in Colombia, where my mother's family is from. In the Machias Valley area, we do a lot of local organizing. In addition to the graphic stuff, locally, we're barely even known for these posters, which everywhere outside of Machias, everybody knows this as our reference point. So Machias, we, as a collective in the late 90s, early 2000s, squatted a Grange Hall that was about to fall over. It was just in disrepair. And restored the building completely, volunteer work hours. And for the building's 100th birthday in 2005, we reopened it as a community cultural center for the Machias Valley area. We function, we kind of help coordinate the building that has all sorts of classes and workshops and theater nights, knitting circles, all that type of stuff goes on in the building. There's only 3 rules for the activities in the building. They must be substance free, they must be all ages, and they must be free of entry. Other than that, the building's pretty much open for everybody who wants to use it. And what else? And we've also, developed relationships with other local processes, whether they be land defense processes, migrant worker farm rights. Specifically in the summer, there's a 6-week blueberry raking season. So there's a lot of folks from Mexico and Honduras who come up. So, the summer camps with the kids, actually 2 of our Beehive members coordinate the summer camps with the kids of the migrant farm workers. And there's also the Passamaquoddy First Nations that lives there. We have done work with them, have helped them out on certain issues. And local folks as well, the Mainer people, the fisher folks, and the folks who live in the woods. In Colombia, we've existed since 2007, but I'll get more into our Colombia work in the second half of the presentation. I will take a pause now for any questions about the collective, our history, our organization, our methodology. And then I'll go on with what does that mean? The intricacies of the graphic and what does it represent. And if you guys think about another question later on, it doesn't occur to you now, it doesn't matter, it's no big deal. Just taking a pause. I'd like to note that in the collective, we are very pro-popular education. We don't really agree with the traditional form of education of bank education, where I am the sole holder of knowledge and I'm just gonna kind of regurgitate it to you. We feel that everybody has the capacity to teach and to learn, and that we can use these, and we have used these, with methodologies that allow that to happen, where everybody has to listen and teach the others in some shape or form, and it really breaks that dynamic. Because of time restrictions, we're not going to do that today, so I'll apologize for that, because usually when we do it, it can be anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. And, it's a whole process, but it's definitely enriching when the space and the context allow for it. So just to keep in mind that the way that we're going to work this today is not the way to work it, it's just a way to explore it. Yes?
If people, art students or community members wanted to be involved in the collective, how much time would they need? Would they need to travel to Machias, or and how much time could they spend that would be useful?
There's a lot of different ways to be involved. A lot of folks do go to the work parties that we have in Machias in July and August, but that's not necessarily the way to get involved. When I went to Machias for the first time, it was 2005, so I'd already been part of the collective for 3 years before I went. But for most people, that's the easiest way. And it really depends on what the person's looking for and how to get involved. If they want to do the local organizing stuff, like we're about to open a print press shop in Machias in the downtown area, so if folks are interested in that, you would need to go to Machias. If you're interested in a graphic campaign, not necessarily. We're making a graphic right now about Detroit, and all that work is based out of Detroit, so there's really no need to go to Machias for that. And on our website, we have a little section that's, people who are interested, we call them wannabes, but, with 2 E's. And there's 20 questions that you can fill out, and sometimes we are doing a call out because we are looking for folks with specific skills. And then there's other times where we're not so specific, but it's kind of just open to what's ever going on. In the summer, a lot of times we need help managing all the gardens in the house where we have, because we have a lot of people in the work parties. So we try to grow as much as we can and support local producers, things like that. So there's different ways to become involved. Like I've been involved for a long time, and minimally, I've had a minimal presence in Machias, barely any work at all there. So we're going to look at these 2 graphics now. They go hand in hand. As humans, we feel a lot of times that we have this bad habit of focusing on the negative, on the problems, and not on the alternatives and the solutions that are actually working. And we've done that in past graphics. You look at the Plan Colombia graphic, and 4/5 of it is this very depressing story about 500 years of colonization. And there's like a little sliver at the bottom that tries to be uplifting about a future, and doesn't really do an effective job at it. So to counteract that, we've made these 2 graphics in one. So the outside, which is the one further in the back, the smaller one, the one that you can see where I'm holding up here, is the top-down perspective. It's the hegemonic view, it's the colonizer's perspective of someone who comes to an area and basically imposes their presence. And it's on purpose, and I'll show you a moment with the poster, that this one right next to it is doubly large. Because we wanted the good news and the inspirational to occupy more space and time within what we're being communicated, so we lead with an uplifted attitude. So when we open this graphic, it's like a triptych, like the old school science boards. You open it, and on the inside you have the scene over there, which is from the bottom up. If you look in the left-hand scene, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a ceiba tree. And the angle by which we're looking at that tree is as if we were a little ant on the root. And I'm going to close up to these scenes in a moment on the screen. But I'm just trying to give you the perspective of the 2 different graphics and how they compare. And how it's all a matter of perspective. Because in the end, they're telling the exact same story. But who is telling the story and how they tell it is what changes. So we'll start with this detail in here. Actually, I might go in even a little more.
Would it help to have the lights off, or is it okay as it is?
How does everybody feel? Y'all are the ones seeing.
I think it's fine. It's okay.
So do y'all see that pretty well?
Yeah.
Okay. I can try and make it a little bit bigger, but I don't know how pixelated it'll get if I make it.
That is better.
Yeah? Okay. So we were speaking earlier, Michelle was speaking earlier about the local victories that y'all have had locally against a lot of the infrastructure that's based on extracting things from the earth. So we're going to look critically at this idea, this mentality, this idea that if there's a mountain, you have to mine it, if there's a river, you have to dam it, and the earth is not alive, it's just there for us to exploit and take things out of. And we're going to look very critically at this model and see how it's really all over the world. In Western Canada is represented with tar sands. In Central America, Mesoamerica, Mexico, we're going to look at what is called Plan or Project Mesoamerica. And then later on, we'll look at IRSA, which is the South American equivalent. But what we're seeing is that this is a mentality that's being imposed in territories all over the world. There's no regard for who lives there or what is present in those areas, but it's the same idea of this very hegemonic narrative of what is progress and what is development. 2 concepts that are not very tangible, and each and every person could define them differently for themselves. But we see that the folks who have this institutional power from the states and the large international institutions are defining it for their interests and imposing that definition on local communities, as well as the projects themselves. So when we talk about Plan Mesoamerica, the details that we see on the landmass are what gives us the idea. If you look in the larger graphic, there's that big circle that's kind of in the middle. This circle is the colonizer's map. It's something that maybe Columbus would have looked at when they were lost in the Atlantic. And if you look closely at the details on the landmass, which is Mesoamerica, Mexico, the Central American countries, and a little part of Colombia, we can see the roads, we can see the pipelines, the dams, the electrical grids, These greenhouses with animals trapped in them, which we'll talk about later what those represent. And this is basically what is Plan Mesoamerica. This is what the infrastructure looks like. Looks a little closer. That's all the infrastructure that's being imposed as part of this project. When we look around this map, there's a lot of details in the water happening around the landmass. There are going to be in the four cardinal directions, we're going to look at trade winds. And the trade winds represent these international systems that either push or pull peoples or goods. And we're going to look how that's working within this territory that we're looking at. We're going to see boats, and the boats represent things that are being taken or also brought over as part of these relationships. And we're also going to see, we'll see a compass rose that talks this, but we're going to see boats that talk about historical relationships to also give us context of contemporary relationships. So the first historical relationships that we can look at are represented with these three boats right here. And this talks about the triangular trade. So here we have a boat that is bringing African people enslaved. And we draw a parallel with the prison industrial complex, looking at the parallels that exist between the enslavement of African peoples and how people of color, specifically black folks in this country, are disproportionately impacted by policing and militarization within communities. But in the colonial sense, when these folks were brought over to work for free, most of their work in the Caribbean was geared at sugar production. That's why we have Kool-Aid on that boat. And if you look closely, there's spoons of sugar as the oars, the crow's nests are cupcakes, and the flags are rollers with cavities. So that book also, talks about the sugar production wasn't for candies, it was mostly for rum. And then the trafficking of humans and the trafficking of rum were used to make vast profits, and along with the gold items and statues and carvings from indigenous communities that were stolen, that we see in this boat, all these profits are taken back to Europe. So we see that Europe and European descendants all over the world hegemonically have this position of dominant power, not because of lies like they know how to work harder and others don't, but because there is this hundreds and hundreds of years of systematic oppression and basically creating the world as we see it today, politically, socially, and militarily. To give us context of why free trade agreements happen the way they happen today, when they're not even free trade agreements, where the US might continue to subsidize producers of certain things, but their counterparts in the free trade agreement don't have the same benefit. Who do we see here? Anybody recognize it? Starbucks and the other one? Chiquita Banana, formerly known as United Fruit Company. So we talk about the compass rose here, and we see it's a roulette table. We have these two logos of those two companies, and we're going to focus more on the monocrop than in the companies themselves. So the bananas and the coffee as a whole. And then we're also going to see the tanks, the trains, and the firearms. So we're looking at a period of history really not that long ago, about 100 years ago, where the US disparagingly looked at many Central American and South American countries as banana republics, where basically we were a source region to produce vast amounts of certain monocrops like bananas and coffee for North American and European markets. When popular social movements existed that put these vast landholdings in danger, we see the CIA-backed political assassinations of political leaders that were promoting these agrarian reforms, like in Guatemala with the assassination of Jacobo Arbenz, or in Colombia with the assassination of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan in the 1950s. So, giving us again, a context, a historical context for how these relationships exist. So we're going to look at the climate now. And coming from the north, we have this big cloud right here that doesn't seem very friendly with those symbols that it has. Radioactive, flames, skull and crossbones. And this cloud right here represents violence. But we have a plural interpretation of violence. So violence is not just, I put it too low. Violence is not just the boat with firearms as we see here, the war boat. Violence is agro-industry and chemicals towards the earth, because you are being violent towards the earth and then indirectly our bodies when we consume those goods from the harvest. Violence is tourism and the ability of a global elite to impose their presence on local peoples wherever they want in the world, regardless of what those people feel. Disclaimer, being a tourist is not the same as being a traveler. How and with what intention do you go to other places? How do you engage local people and local economies? Are you aware of your presence and how you take up space? All of these are major issues when you go into territories where you're not from and how you carry yourself. So it's not like saying don't go anywhere you're not from, that's bad. It's not so cut and dry. There's a lot of context to it and how you can carry yourself in other territories. So this little boat here, I like to zoom in because everybody can recognize those figures. So this is the cultural imperialism boat on a Coca-Cola bottle. Mickey Mouse dressed as Santa Claus listening to an iPod, Bart Simpson as Superman, Scrooge McDuck as Uncle Sam, and Joe Camel. In my village in Colombia, all the children recognize these figures. But if I ask them about our traditional folklore and our traditional beings, the supernatural beings as we call them, most of the kids don't know them and most of them don't care. So it's not simply saying that learning about things from other places is bad, but in the learning of things from other places, we shouldn't learn about our own unique identities and our own land-based knowledge that we have in our communities. So this is what's coming from the north. When we go to the south, and what we have is this big old hurricane. And the eye of the hurricane are these silhouettes of soldiers and militarization. And around the hurricane, we can see there's a little bit of water and flames. And since it goes south to north, here we're talking about the root cause of migration, displacement. And if you want to look the main reason why people leave home, why they leave where they're from, it's militarization. It's the folks in the eye of the hurricane. But on the outskirts, we see those waves and those flames, and we're also talking about the climate crisis and how climate refugees are being forced from their communities. I grew up in South Florida. Newspapers reported about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, that now the estimate is within 10 years South Florida will not be habitable. So even here in the United States, we will see entire regions that long before they're underwater, people will not be able to live there. They will not be able to inhabit there. And what that means for those peoples, those identities, those histories, those cultures, those ecosystems, when those types of things happen. We call it climate crisis and not climate change because when you say climate change, first off, it doesn't address the urgency of the issue. And second off, it doesn't address the fact that there are people responsible for that happening. It's not, we don't believe that we're all equally responsible for what's going on, by no means necessary. Like nobody in this room, as far as I know, could be equally responsible as like the CEO of Exxon, or Shell for that matter. So there is a differentiated responsibility, and most of us never had a choice whether or not we could be part of this system or opt out if we wanted to. So we're very critical of that as well, in that there are people behind us who are making profits from it. From Asia, we have this cloud of mass production. We can see all the disassembled parts that are being sent to Mesoamerica. So you like have an action figure of SpongeBob and the computers and the flip-flops and the iPods. And they're sent out on these barges that we see here with the containers following the arrows. These goods arrive unassembled to the Caribbean coast, the Pacific coast of Central America. So here we see a roll of cloth that as it's sent through the maquila, the sweatshop zone, by the time it gets to the Caribbean, it's a three-piece suit. These are loaded onto barges once again, and they're taken to this large vacuum cleaner, the consumerism tornado, that represents consumer markets in North America and Europe. And we can see that things like styrofoam cups and plastic straws that will never go away but are used one time are within that vortex of mess. And also things like television sets that still work, but because they're not flat screen TVs, people don't want them anymore. They just throw them away because they're not new. Really quickly, I'm going to go over the boats. This is the fishing boat, the overfishing boat, the oceans. It's too big. There. This is the water privatization boat, a big old water bottle. We were just talking about this in the car. The cattle ranching boat, accompanied by deforestation. They go hand in hand, especially in tropical areas all over the world, not only the Americas. Here is the animal boat, where these animal lives are turned into profit, whether they be for skins or pets. Down here, or up here better said, here's the drug boat with the CIA logo. And behind it has a washing machine where dollar bills are coming out, talking about money laundering. And then this digital version is a little bit older than some of than this final version. So this mining boat right here doesn't have any logos or on the flags, on the sails. But if you look over there, it actually has the Canadian flag on the sail. And that's because Canada is a fiscal paradise for mining corporations. They do not pay taxes there, so 75% of all the world's mining corporations are based out of Canada. Mostly in Vancouver and Toronto. It's not to say their CEOs are Canadian, so you have people like Colombians, Venezuelans, Israelis, Brazilians that will go to Canada, open shop for their mining corporations, and then send them all over the world. From Papua New Guinea to Guatemala to Congo to Tanzania, and then they wreak all the havoc, whether it be gold mining or rare metals, things of that nature. And of course, the boat that has the most amount of guns on it is the oil boat. I think the history of this country gives a lot of reference to why that boat would be the most common. So that's the circle. That's the map that we looked at. Now what we're going to see on the columns, the sides, as well as the corners, are other relationships that impose themselves on this territory. In each corner, we're going to look at the international institutions responsible for these policies. Each one will have a costume to give us clues about what they do, but none of them will have a face. Because even though these institutions are led by people with names, family members, and home addresses, there's nobody to put face or take responsibility for the consequences of the actions of the policies that they're imposing on a global level. And we'll start out with the World Trade Organization up here. What does our costume look like to y'all? Judge. But a judge of injustice, unfortunately. And we see, well, actually, before I even explain anything, anybody know what the WTO does? I would like to share a little bit. You know, just give them a chance just in case. So when there's free trade agreements between countries, and somebody was, yes?
My sense is that they seize assets and sell them for private profit and leave the local citizens lacking.
Exactly. And they create all the different policies that allow this to happen. They kind of make up the rules.
Like selling and drinking waters.
Exactly. So we have examples. One of the best examples I can think of is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It happened between the US, Canada, and Mexico in 1994. There's a California corporation, whose name escapes me, that makes an additive to gasoline. So it supposedly burns cleaner, but ironically enough, it causes cancer. So Canada saw this and they created a law that this additive could not be added to gasoline. In a WTO tribunal, the California corporation sues the Canadian government. They win. Canada is forced to eliminate this law from their legal system. And the Canadian government has to pay back the corporation like $20 million in lost prior profits. So when we look at laws that exist for public health, the environmental rights, or workers' rights, these free trade agreements put them as like total targets that can be eliminated effectively. We represent that with the riot cop hand puppet that has the gavel and is playing whack-a-mole with the different social movements that are protesting the policies of the World Bank. Here you have the Zapatistas, the autonomous indigenous movement from southern Mexico. You have Vandana Shiva, the ecologists from India. And then over here we have a balance, where on this side we have hung, lynched, the traditional attires of native peoples from all over the world. But what weighs more on this balance is the velvet pillow with the top hat, representing the interests of the global elite, and how those rulings always play out at the WTO, given more priority to the interests of these companies and not the laws that would protect territories and people. So down here we have the World Bank, the casino owner. If we look closely at the table in front of them, we can see there are 4 continents and there are gambling chips. North America and Europe have a large accumulation of gambling chips, but Africa and South America have very few. Africa and South America also have bear traps to talk about the external debt that countries have to take on when these loans are taken out for the different projects that they are. It's worth mentioning too that many times when these loans are taken out, corrupt politicians will keep all the money for themselves, but the people through their taxes and their work will have to pay back those loans with interest rates. So the projects that supposedly will make people's lives better never really even happen to begin with, but the debt does. And the younger brother, or sibling, better said, of the World Bank is the Inter-American Development Bank, dressed as a conquistador cash register. So, because we took entirely too long to make this graphic, halfway through it, this subject kind of changed. When we started in 2003, it was called Plan Puebla-Panama. Puebla is a state in Mexico and Panama the country, and the macro project went from Puebla to Panama. More or less in 2008, they revamped the project. They expand the territory to go from Texas to Colombia and call it Project Mesoamerica. So that's why here we have PPP written, Plan Puebla Panama, and the salesperson with the selling PPP as a rainbow with a pot of gold is selling to the people cut out in paper this idea that it's going to be progress and development. The finger puppet governments shake up the people and steal the money, and the coins that come out of their pockets, as well as the dollar bills, become the pipelines and the highways that are financed for that whole territory, for that whole area. And when a country takes out a loan from either of these banks, and they're not able to pay it back, they have to ask for assistance, for a bailout. And they come to the sinister surgeon for the bailout, the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF is they're pretty okay about giving money to the countries when they need it. But you know, with certain agreements, these agreements known as SAP, Structural Adjustment Policies, basically force the countries to privatize a lot of the services that the people have a right to. So to get money, you know, let's say Argentina in 2001, the IMF will come in and tell them you have to privatize your education, your health care, your water, your electricity. And we represent this, you know, with the battered body of Mesoamerica being operated upon by the sinister surgeon. The water and the electricity are being taken out. Here we have water, DNA, oil being extracted. The leeches on the body of the area are the external debt that remains with the help from the IMF. Here the cement truck, IV, is injecting their type of progress and development into the area. The dams are the defibrillators, because the IMF actually talks about their policies being shock treatment for economies. And the last little detail is this knot in the stethoscope, because the IMF doesn't listen to the heart of the people. So each member of the collective has a different perspective for this graphic and how it works. Just like all of you, you know, we're all different people. And the way I interpret the two columns on the side and the row at the bottom, I see them as mechanisms of displacement. They're ways to get people off of their land. Whatever the interest is, what is basically happening is people are losing their land and being pushed off. So the more typical one that we hear of, that we are aware of, is the one that we see up here. And we see how people are organizing and protesting. And then the government sends armed groups to massacre and bury the bodies in mass graves and burn the communities and policies of scorched earth, like we saw in Guatemala in the 1980s during that genocide in that country. Though we actually look at a comparison of this, because we don't see this violence and displacement as something unique to humans, or ants in this case. But here we talk about how it's happening to plants, and the plants that give us life specifically. So here we have a mix of a tractor and a tank that's assaulting the mother plant of corn with these modified genes, as what is happening to traditional varieties of crops with genetically modified crops. And right below it, we have the Trojan horse of agro-industry, backed up by Monsanto and Cargill and Syngenta. And out of this Trojan horse is coming the corn conquistadors of genetically modified corn that have come to attack and poison the native variety of corn. And they're infecting this corn just the way colonizers did when they came to this hemisphere with the diseases they brought to native people, but also how genetically modified crops have genes, or their DNA will infect the heirloom varieties of crops when they cross-pollinate. So drawing that metaphor that exists between that. And when we're going to talk about mechanisms of resistance, when we talk about resistance to this food industrialization, we have to talk about our own food sovereignty. So here we see ants that are planting and trading their own corn, and they're also grinding it up to make their own tortillas, or arepas. The spider is weaving and recuperating the fertility of the earth, and we will see their cousin briefly. So the lower scene is a little bit more complex and difficult to understand because it's also a very somewhat new phenomenon, and it has to do with the carbon trade and what is called green capitalism. We see this is a false solution. This is not real. It doesn't help. This idea that companies and countries who have large emissions of carbon can do other projects elsewhere on the other side of the world and offset those emissions, it's a lie. It's a false solution, and it's actually just a way of greenwashing or appearing that things are okay and that consumers can continue to consume guiltless with being guilt-free and not recognizing that the earth isn't dying, it's actually being killed. And we see this in one of its first most sinister ways with this greenhouse. So this has to do with the protection of lands through conservation, but how it's imposed on local communities and not done through a collaborative consensus project. And here we have that represented with the bees getting a boot or kicked out of their territory. And we've seen how large green environmental organizations like Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund have funded projects to make parks in countries like Guatemala or Tanzania or India, supposedly to protect the biodiversity, but many times allowing either pharmaceutical or biotech companies to go and do research, or even allow like royal families from countries like Abu Dhabi to go hunt in areas where they won't allow the native people to continue hunting the way they have. As you can see, the plants and the animals are not being protected. They're taken out 2 by 2. They go into the table, and they come out as gambling chips on the other side because they're turning to profit. And we see that before the bees are completely displaced, in a greenwashing effort, the industries will use the image of native people to create marketing materials about how they work hand in hand with local communities, even though it's a lie. And then here we see the boot giving the bee the final kick out, because we also talk about the reality of conservation refugees, which have happened in the world as a result of this. Here at the round table, we see different polluted industries that have put on animal masks to talk about the greenwashing tactics. So the timber industry has the butterfly mask, the water bottle has a fish mask. You can see them up there. And they're celebrating on this birthday cake of Mesoamerica, celebrating over 500 years of plunder in that territory. And the more complicated one to understand, but it's really important, especially for those of us who are in the anti-dam struggle, is this chessboard here. So there's this program by the World Bank called CDMs, Clean Development Mechanisms, and they're actually a big lie. They're one of these scenarios where the cure is worse than the disease. So we have industries that are recognized as polluted, like oil and coal. And then industries or corporations that have investment in this, because of the carbon trade, now have limits to how much they can pollute. And they have these projects where they can supposedly offset the emissions that they're doing. But the projects that are recognized as green or clean development mechanisms are actually worse, in many cases, than the ones that actually are recognized as polluting. So big dams are recognized as a CDM. Like dams that emit large amounts of CO2 and methane are recognized as that. Agrofuel. So like all the forest fires that are occurring in Indonesia, and they might plant that land once again with oil palm afterwards, that oil palm will be recognized as clean development. Natural gas, large-scale wind and nuclear, and even reforestation, not reforestation, monocrops of trees that are intended to be chopped down in 15 to 20 years and might be genetically modified are being recognized as as reforestation projects. So they get money for doing this in addition to the project itself, and we're being told that this is going to save Earth, that this is going to counter-effect everything that's happening. We don't believe that. And if you look closely, you see the two ponds here, the dark pond and the light pond, shaking hands, because they're really on the same side. It's this false dichotomy of like the fossil fuel folks and everybody else that they're playing against each other on this chessboard. They're all on the same side. They're all in it together. The last last mechanism of displacement we're going to see is up here. We'll switch over to the other graphic. And we have the beehive up here. Let's see if I can zoom in more. So, you know, in all of our peoples, wherever we are from in the world, there's one point in history where land was not property. Land belonged to the people that lived and worked on that land and took care of the land, but it wasn't like this thing that you can grab and put in your pocket and walk away. It doesn't belong to people. And we represent that with the beehive, where all the bees live together, they're collectively. In every place in the world, at some point in history, something happened to change that, and land became property. So as a result of the Mexican Revolution, whose battle cry was Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom, the people of Mexico had an article included in their constitution called the Ejido Act, which allowed for collectively owned lands that couldn't be bought, rent, sold, or inherited. And they're basically of the people who worked there. But to join the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico was forced to eliminate this article for their constitution. And that's where we see that farmer B has to get a deed to their parcel of land, and they get money in the form of a loan from the agrarian bank. Farmer B goes to grow corn on their land, but when they come to sell corn to market, the market has been flooded with subsidized corn from the US, and farmer B can't compete with those prices. Here we see the balance in the corn. Farmer B can't compete with these prices and is not able to sell their corn. So what they have to do is sell their land to pay back the loan, and effectively they become displaced. Farmer B has three options, two of which we'll look at here. The first option is to move to a big city, move to a big city. If you can, build a little house out of wood and cardboard in a shanty town in the outskirts of the city. And if you're lucky, you get a job in a sweatshop. You most likely won't get a job in a sweatshop because a lot of people are trying to get those jobs. You'll have to participate in some informal work on the streets, like buying a bag of candy and selling the candies one by one on a bus, things like that. The other bees take another option, which is to risk their lives and migrate north. And here we see the bees walking across Mexico with their water bottles and their backpacks, not knowing if they'll ever make it back or they hear from their family again. And on the US-Mexican border that's highly militarized, we can see the skulls of bees that litter that border, and all the people who didn't make that journey. In the lower part of this column, we have the cousin of that spider I mentioned earlier. It's the quetzal. The quetzal is a sacred bird to many native peoples in Mesoamerica. It's small, iridescent green with a red chest, and has floofy feathers on its head. And the bird might be about this big, but its tail feathers are about my arm span. And they can't live in captivity, so you'll never see them in a pet store or a zoo. They just will not survive. And they're deemed very important culturally. You know, there's a deity, Quetzalcoatl, named after this bird. The currency in Guatemala is the quetzal, so it has a lot of significance to people. And this bird is weaving a tapestry with bird designs, because the idea is that it's weaving something of its own culture, its own identity, its own people. Behind the quetzal, we see a Mayan temple that has a Catholic church built on top of it. And here we talk about the imposition of foreign values as part of the colonial process, something that was seen throughout this hemisphere and much of the world. The church tower frays the fabric of the weaving. The fabric up here completely frays. The strings go into the sweatshop, feed the sewing machines, and out comes the commercialized clothes from Nike and Tommy Hilfiger that go into the shopping mall built on top of the church. Because it didn't end with the church. This imposition of foreign values is something that has continually happened with the imposition of consumerism as the status quo. And it's to be noted that maybe we don't even need to call them values. We can call them anti-values because they're very destructive socially and ecologically to where we are living. So now that I've all depressed you, we are done with the top-down analysis-heavy systems of oppression, and we are going to look at the stories of resistance. I'm not going to go over the entire graphic because we've already been about 40 minutes presenting. And we have till 2, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Or take your time.
Okay. So here you don't see it as well, so I'm going to reference this one at first. The majority of this banner is like this brownish sepia color. And the idea, this is what we see and hear and interact with every day. I recognize some people see and hear a little bit more than the rest of us, but for most people, this is what we see and hear with every day. The sky blue areas represent the spiritual realm. And we recognize that each person and each peoples might interpret these concepts in very different ways of what is a spirituality. But we don't want to get into the details of what that looks like. We just recognize that it exists and it's present for people. And we'll leave it there. And then in the corners, on these sides, and on the bottom, there's these other characters that I've drawn in with black and white lines, a little bit thicker, in the same style of the graphic over there. And those are invader characters. They're the ones who are trying to bring this reality over here, and they're being met with resistance. So as I mentioned, we have the ceiba tree, and it comes down, and the root systems divide all the different scenes of resistance that is going on within the scene. And you interpret it with the 3 layers that I just explained. This graphic has over 400 species of plants, animals, insects, and fungi, all native to the region. We use biological diversity as a metaphor for human diversity and all the different ways that it can exist. And we go such to a emphasis of showing this that each ant is a different ant species and no ant repeats itself. So I'm not going to go over all the different scenes of resistance, but I will title all of them so you kind of know what issues are talked about. These animals that are white at the very top, that I'm following with the cursor here, you can also see them on the large banner. Those animals, as well as certain skeletons that we're going to see throughout the graphic, represent ancestor creatures. And when we did our research tour, one of the main things that was emphasized to us by the different communities that we met is that if we were going to share their stories and show their realities, we had to talk about their ancestors because those ancestors were always present. So this scene that we have right here, you can barely even see it, so I'll zoom in more. This scene right here, with this gorilla radio station and the wetlands and the ecological filters and this queer monster that's playing tug of war with the otter and the axolotl and the glass tree frog, is all about water privatization and the battle around water, as well as this altar to water as a sacred being. Here, the large bulldozer with the industrialized shrimp farm, similar to the industrialized salmon farms in this part of the world, is destroying the mangroves, the coastal forests, and tropical areas, and the birds that have to flee represent displaced communities. But telling the story of many displaced peoples, like those folks from Guatemala that had to live in Mexico during the genocide, they talk about their organization and resistance, and here we see the right of return as the birds are coming back, organized from their years in exile. The ants marching on the tree trunk are folks in protest and mass uprising. On the blades of grass, they are carrying the principles of Zapatismo. The Zapatistas, again, this autonomous indigenous movement that exists in southern Mexico, publicly organized since 1994, politically organized since the early 80s. They have their own army, and basically they are constructing autonomy. They're not looking to overthrow the Mexican government or secede from Mexico, but they do want the whole Mexican state to basically eliminate itself from their territory so that they can build a society that they want and be responsible for everything that they need, whether it be healthcare, education, access to water, electricity, those types of things. This scene here, I'm going to skip one scene because I'll get into it later. This is the birthing scene. Here we see the midwife that's receiving the baby. Here are the doulas, or the comadres, that are helping the mom. And they're surrounded by the medicinal plants that are used in women's health when they're pregnant, when they are birthing, and also in postpartum. This scene where there's mural painting and weaving and music represents historical memory and the way memory is created in many of these communities, whether it be through song, through dance, through weaving and poetry. The scene right here, oops, a little bit too fast, is about militarization, and specifically the role of women protecting their territories from this militarization. All the animals are from different peoples of the region that are facing off these different armed figures. Right next to the militarization scene is the mine, because where these mining operations do occur, they tend to militarize the territory. We represent that together. And here we have the market scene, where oil palm and genetically modified soy and corn, along with the highly processed foods of Bimbo bread, Coca-Cola, and Nestle, are being met with the resistance of pollinator and seed disperser animals in the marketplace that are not allowing them to enter. We have this beehive, right above. Here in the digital version, it's incomplete, like you can see here, but if you look at the printed version, there it is complete. And this beehive represents solidarity economics. They're melopona bees, they're stingless honeybees that are native to the Americas in the tropical area. And they talk about solidarity economics and how to, truly green cottage industries and barter and trade and relationships between elders and youth and the passing on of knowledge and all of that, and how that's a vital part of our organizing and the processes that we do as movements. So our main villain here is this photocopy machine. I know it's really weird, like I've never seen a horror movie with a photocopy machine, but we picked a photocopy machine, but exactly because of what we were talking about earlier, like this development model is like a carbon copy that's just being imposed everywhere around the world. So there's no regard for who and what lives in each place. Let's just mine it. Let's just dam it. Let's just get oil out of there. And that's why our villain is this photocopy machine. That's really complex. If we look at the bottom part of the photocopy machine, we see these mechanical arms because it's a land grab, so it's grabbing the land. The cattle catcher is to displace local peoples. Here the land is being fed into these different levers, and pulleys and systems, where it's being ridden on with gasoline. Money is exchanged, handshakes are given, stamps of approval are done, the mighty dollar is photocopied, and out of the top come the permits that turn into plans, that turn into projects. We see this represented in different scenes. At the bottom we have this massive tourism development with the cruise ship, which represents the struggle of the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people in Honduras against the tourism developments happening in the region, and as they use their traditional music and spirituality to call a hurricane to destroy this tourism development. Here the workers are squash that are blocking this industrialized road that has nothing to do with people's use but big industry use from being created. And the beans are the teachers and the students in the classroom. Up here the corn is fighting off this airport that's being created in the corner of the farmers. I don't know if anybody just realized, but the students, the workers, and the farmers are corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, that are grown together. They're plants that when grown together, they support each other and have reciprocal relationships of mutual aid, but also when eaten together, they have a combination of amino acids that are so complex that it's one of the most complete proteins that we can eat, and our capacity to digest them together is superior if we were to eat two and one of the others is missing. So we use this as a metaphor because if these plants can support each other growing and they support our bodies when they're eaten together, what would it mean if educators and students were to unite with workers and were to unite with rural people like farmers? We think we'd be pretty unstoppable. So we use this as a metaphor of how these different sectors in society need to come together to have more popular force against these policies that are being imposed. The specific story of the corn in the airport is of the farmers of a community called Atenco outside of Mexico City, and it was one of the first popular defeats of La Ampuela, Panama. The Mexican government was seeking to impose this airport on their territory, expropriate their lands, give them something absurd like $3,000 the acre, and just forcibly remove them. They said they wouldn't allow it, that they would fight to the death. They did marches, there was protests, they blockaded their territory. They were attacked by riot police, as you can see there. 3 days of fighting in the streets, the farmers with machetes and rocks, the riot police with firearms. Fortunately, nobody was killed. Prisoners were taken on both sides, so this forced the Mexican state to treat the farmers as equals, and there was a prisoner swap. But what happened in those 3 days is that the Mexican government was so shamed for what they were doing that they had to back off the project. Because on the international level, everybody was talking bad about what was going on in Mexico. But as we say in Latin America, la lucha sigue, the struggle continues. And just last year, the Mexican government decided to reopen the plans of this airport. So we will probably see future confrontations in that area again. Here we see out of the power lines, out of the paper come the power lines. And the scene that is, the struggle that inspired this is the struggle against CIEPAC, which is the electrical grid of North America being connected with the one of South America through an area called in the border area of Panama and Colombia. There's no highways there, there's no pipelines, there's no electrical grids, there's no infrastructure. It's actually the most biodiverse ecosystem in the entire world, the wettest place on Earth. Only 2 days a year it doesn't rain, and the native territory of like 8 or 9 First Nations communities and many Afro-descendant populations. So they want to send all this infrastructure through there, log the forest, have huge negative impacts in the area. People are obviously not okay with it, which we show with the resistance of these spirit birds, the ancestor birds that are attacking. If you look closely at the tower, there is a deer and a jaguarandi cat with a saw going at the base. In 2001, we learned about something that went on in Venezuela. So in the tri-border area of Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil, there is a First Nations people called the Pemon. And Brazil and Venezuela were connecting their electrical grids as nations through their territory at this time. Everybody was kind of against the project, but nobody was doing anything about it. So as we were told the story, one night all the grandmothers came out and started dissing everybody, just insulting folks. Y'all are worthless, you're good for nothing, all you do is talk. We may as well have no one here because all of you are not making a difference in any shape or form. And by morning, 6 of these towers were thrown on the ground. So the actions led by the Pemon grandmothers resulted in these towers being thrown on the ground. At that time, Venezuela was rewriting the constitution. Chavez had just come into power. And because of these actions, the right to prior and informed consultation was included within the Venezuelan constitution for indigenous communities. I do want to include a disclaimer. In Colombia, we rewrote our constitution in 1991. And since then, we have the exact same article. But what we have seen is that if communities are not organized and are not vigilant, the state will do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. So it's really up to communities to be paying attention and ready to organize themselves through direct action and legal action to defend themselves from these possible threats that will be constant. Connected to this power line, we have the dam. I will talk about the dam that inspired this scene because later I will talk about the dam that is in my region in Colombia, unfortunately. So this scene is a little bit misleading. We have these social spiders, which are spiders that live together. They're not like most spiders that are really solitary and don't want neighbors. These like live in collective. So they made their big spider web together in the city. They are a metaphor for the web of resistance, or the weaving, the social weaving or unity of these communities to be resilient. And through popular rejection and mass rejection of this dam that's being taken down. So I say this as misleading because it tells the story of the people in an area of the state of Guerrero in Mexico that are resisting against a dam called La Parota. And it's misleading because the dam was never built, so there's obviously a dam, but the La Parota dam has never been built, and the people of the region achieved that, but not by writing cards and letters. They achieved it by blockading the area where they live for the last 13 years. They have the clarity to understand that if you want to stop one of these projects, it is much more strategic to not allow the machinery to be brought onto the ground than trying to stop it once the machinery is on the ground. So for 13 years they've been blockading the roads into their territory. The dam has not been built and it has been effective. And it's very much incorporated into their daily life. So to give an example, the first week of the month, our families have to do blockade. The second week of the month, it's y'all families have to do it. The third weekend of the month, it's y'all's families. And keep in mind, these are families that have anywhere from a dozen to 20 people. So it's not like you have to be on that road, on the asphalt, for those 7 days, 24 hours a day. You switch out amongst your family members and your neighbors, and it's pretty much incorporated to everyday life. Everybody benefits because we're all farmers, we all live off of our land, and we don't want our land to be flooded. So in that way, it's pretty effective, and they've been able to protect their territory for these 13 years that way. So now that we've looked at all these horrible things, we're going to end on 2 inspiring scenes that have no invader characters. And here we have the party. The party is one of my favorite scenes. Not because I'm a party animal, I'm actually a homebody. But why I like the party is because of what it communicates and what is the central theme of the party. And what we see is that there's a fire in the center of the party. And we see a relationship. We have 3 elder animals telling stories to 3 youth. And we really focus on this relationship between elders and youth. So we have the armadillo, the sloth, and the tapir telling stories of imprisonment, journey, and liberation. In the youth are a crocodile, a turtle, and a cuaramani, which is like a raccoon. They're surrounded by musicians that have different elements of the earth and their representation. Here we see the octopus playing drums representing water, the reddish heron playing the double flute that represents water, wind. The tamandua anteater playing a jarana or a charango, a little guitar with earth. The ichthyostega, which is an ancestor character, a prehistoric amphibian, is playing their own tail vertebrae as a marimba. And the hoatzin, a bird that has fingers on its wings, that's pretty incredible, was so inspired that it picked up the maracas and was just shaking them, and it represents fire. We talk a lot about death, so we have to be balanced and talk about life. So this animal right here, known as an aguripaka, is pregnant and it's dancing. And these two snails here are making baby snails. Yes, even mollusk pornography in this piece. So here we have the assembly scene, and it's what we'll close with. We emphasize that everything that we've just seen are strategies of resistance, and they are tactics for land defense, and they can work. But the decision-making process by which they go through is really, in a lot of sense, what might decide whether they do or do not work. So in the assembly, we see that all the animals and plants are sitting together in a circle. No one is leading, no one is dictating. There's a diversity of animals. We have mammals, we have birds, reptiles, amphibians, mollusks, insects, and flowering plants, and then some succulents in the top. So everybody can participate, because we believe that for these decision-making processes to work, and these strategies to work, everybody has to be involved, and there can't be any separation. Everybody has the right to speak as well as to be heard. And if we look even closer, we get into more details that emphasize who has the right to be in these spaces, more than just species, no? So here we see a parent or older sibling with babies on their back, little tadpoles on the frog being carried. Here we see a breastfeeding mother. Here we see Here we see an ancestor spirit. Here we see the smallest as well as the largest cooperating. We even see a differently abled gecko. Musicians. So really, emphasizing everybody needs to participate in these spaces if these processes are going to work. That spiral in the middle. So if you look at different scenes, we have this little spiral that you can see in a lot of different scenes. This is a Mayan hieroglyphic called voluta. So when the spiral goes up in a voluta, I'll just draw it. It looks better drawn. When the spiral goes up, it means speech. That's someone is speaking. When the spiral goes down, it signifies that someone is listening. And when two spirals find each other, we have a conversation. We have people speaking and listening to each other. And we represent this, so our artistic freedom, walk with the voluta, for all these peoples coming together in an assembly and taking decisions together and listening to each other, and then based on those decisions, walking them and creating them a reality. So that's kind of our interpretation with this big old, really weird cosmic spiral in the middle. But that's how we're trying to signify the words becoming united with the symbol of the voluta. And just, reminding us that no one is going to do this for us, our own liberation. We have to assume responsibility. And the leaders that we are waiting for are actually the people that look at us when we look at mirrors, whatever we do, look in those mirrors.